Welcome to the Kinkology podcast. This is your host, relationship and sex therapist, Kaylee Rose Friedman, and this is your permission slip to stop shoulding all over yourself, let go of shame, and learn to embody your most authentic sexual self. Hello, friends. Welcome to the very first episode of the Kinkology podcast. Yay! I'm so excited. This is your host, Kaylee Rose. I am going to spend this episode just introducing myself. We're going to talk some shit about society. I'm going to tell my backstory a bit, and then we'll talk about what you can expect to hear on this podcast. So, I'm a certified sex therapist. I work with mostly sexual minorities, so queer folks, people who are in non-monogamous relationships, people who are kinky. I myself am kink identified, and I love to work with people who are living outside the dominant culture in some way. I am currently working on my PhD in clinical sexology, which I'm enjoying very much. I am an insatiably curious person, so a lot of what you'll get from me is the latest study that comes out. I'm constantly reading books, attending conferences. I'm attending workshops as often as I can. And actually, the way my brain is just constantly humming is a huge part of why I love kink so much, because it's one of the few spaces that I can really shut off my thinking mind and just be fully present in my body and in my pleasure. So, speaking of pleasure, we have been shamed. As a society, we have been shamed out of our natural and healthy sexual expression, and I am mad about it. That is one of the main reasons that I've created this podcast, is that I am furious that we have this society where we are being controlled in a way that divorces us from our own intuition. Because when people divorce us from our intuition and they make us believe that we are inherently bad, our natural impulses are inherently bad, and then they tell us, oh, but don't worry, for only $39.95 I can fix you. Or don't worry, for, donating to us every Sunday, we can fix you. Then in that process, mostly religion and now capitalism has really poisoned how we understand ourselves. It's poisoned how we understand our relationships. It's poisoned how we understand our bodies. And when we can't understand ourselves, then we can't communicate with others, particularly about sex, because that is such a charged topic. It can feel too embarrassing. It can feel too scary. Or in the worst case scenarios, it can feel so overwhelming and triggering if we have any kind of PTSD or trauma that we can completely shut down. So because of all this, there are a lot of folks who, in the worst case scenario, can be really harmed in having experiences that you or your partners don't want to have because of a lack of communication. In the best case scenario, you're just leaving a lot of pleasure on the table. We can leave a lot of pleasure on the table. So I wanted to create this podcast so that I could practice and we could practice together, and I could help you start to validate and normalize and explore your sexual self in a way that's just more authentic. Sexual authenticity is not about necessarily having more sex or having a specific type of sex. It's just about having the kind of sex that you want to have or not, if that's sexually authentic to you. It's just about honoring your truth, having healthy boundaries, and learning to communicate openly. And while that might sound simple, there's usually a lot we have to work through to be able to get to that point. So my goal is that this podcast will help with that process. So a little bit about how I got here. I actually started off studying opera, and I went to a small conservatory where there was this culture of overworking. Whoever was overloaded the most and the most stress won that semester. And I was not about it. I did not enjoy that burnout competition. And it really affected how I sang. It affected my health. It affected my mental health. And so that's really when I started my mental health journey, my spiritual journey. I started yoga and became a yoga teacher, and I got really curious and interested in wellness and well-being. And that's ultimately what led me to the therapy space. So when I started my career as a therapist and I began working with couples, I realized that every time couples would bring up sex, I would just get really uncomfortable and turn bright red, and felt very cringy, and I couldn't have those conversations comfortably. And I realized that that is not a good look for a couples therapist. And I really had to take a step back and look at this part of my own life, my own shame. I really had to self-reflect and figure out why I was having these reactions. And I realized that my grad program did not prepare me well for helping people process their sexual selves. There was no class that it was required. Now that I'm sort of on the other side of the work that I had to do, I now understand that sexuality is repressed in our society in all ways, and that includes in therapy programs. So actually, many, many, many therapists have never had a class in human sexuality. It's often kind of tucked in to a class on maybe human development. So as a field, we're also just not great at this. And as a society, we're not great at this. So because I wanted to be the best therapist I could, I recognized that I needed to work on this. And so I essentially did exposure therapy on myself. I started reading, I started listening to podcasts, I started talking to friends, I talked to my own therapist, and I just kept practicing curiosity about the topic of sex until I got more comfortable with it. It took some time. It took discomfort. It took some anxiety. It took breaking up with my fiance, but that's a whole other story. I really went through this whole personal awakening simultaneously as I was developing myself professionally. And on the other side of all of that, I found myself. I found an incredible amount of freedom, creativity, joy, pleasure that was really missing in my life. And I want everyone to be able to experience that. So, sharing a little bit more about my personal journey and my lived experience, I am kink identified. I'm out as a kinky person. That's a very intentional choice I've made after a lot of processing with my own therapist. It's a privilege that I have to work for myself and feel like I'm safe enough to do that. And so I've decided to step into that. It's not a recommendation for everyone. I think I'll actually do a whole episode on coming out kinky and all the intricacies of that, but it's something I share about myself. And I haven't quite decided what exactly my boundaries are going to be around what I disclose to you here. I know that there's a difference between authenticity and transparency, boundaries and secrecy, and I think it's very nuanced, and I'm still exploring and discovering what that looks like. I do want to be open and connect with my fellow kinksters, and at the same time, I do want to protect my own privacy. So we'll see what happens together. For today, I'd like to share a little bit of my sort of origin story, I guess, just so that you have context about where I'm coming from personally as a kinky person. I identify as kink and power exchange as being part of my own sexual orientation. It's something that that my sexuality is really centered around. When I look back through my life, there are lots and lots of clues and experiences and aha moments going back to, being 4 years old that I can point to that tell me that I am a kinky person sort of inherently. But I didn't have a conscious awareness of it, and I didn't discover the kink community until well into adulthood. I didn't explore it until I had been dating and having some experiences, and I was able to really consciously put 2 and 2 together about my kinks and the fact that is a label for them and language and other people who practice this. It's a lifestyle, essentially. I didn't discover the lifestyle until adulthood. So when I did first discover it, I felt a lot of shame and a lot of confusion. And I was really worried about my well-being, and I was worried that there was something inherently wrong with me. And I had a little bit of trouble accepting it about myself, but I was also feeling very inspired and seen and drawn to exploration. And so I talked to friends, and I started Googling things and reading blogs and other people sharing their experience with shame and coming out kinky and discovering the kink community really helped normalize what I was experiencing. And I'm actually working on a book right now that I hope will become the book that I wished I had been able to read when I was first discovering my kink identity. So once I started to feel like once I started to discover the kink community, I became very fascinated, and I jumped in with both feet. I started listening to a ton of podcasts and reading books and talking to people. And then I started going to events, and I started exploring my local dungeon and skills classes. And I got on Field, which is a whole thing, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. But I made some amazing friends and buddies to explore the community with, and play partners to start practicing things with. And I learned a lot in a short period of time, and I'm still constantly exploring and constantly learning, and there's always something new to discover, a new connection, a new practice, a new way of thinking about power and power exchange. And I think one of the things I've discovered personally that draws me into kink is how complex it can be, how psychologically interesting and complex. Some people just want to do kink just to get spanked, and that's fine. The behavior of kink and BDSM is great and fun, but what really draws me in is the psychology and the interpersonal dynamics, the communication skills. When you do BDSM, you can't, well, you can do whatever you want. I wouldn't recommend just winging it. I wouldn't recommend just going in and trying some things out, seeing how your partner reacts without a lot of self-awareness building and communication and negotiation. And I'm sure we'll talk all about that in this podcast. But the intentionality that is required to do BDSM safely is such a draw for me and makes things feel so multi-layered and fascinating and meaningful. That is what I've found to be most interesting about this world and this community, is that I find people to be more self-aware and more intentional and more self-reflective and existential and all the things that I love about being human. So that's a little bit about me. I will share that I generally play a submissive role. I don't think I will talk too much about my particular kinks on this podcast, but I am subby. It gives my brain a nice little break from making decisions and leading and holding space. And so I'm very drawn to that role. And I am excited to have guests on here who embody very different roles and different aspects of kink, so we can have some fun conversations about the differing perspectives of what it's like to enter and play in and be in the community in these different roles, and the different challenges, differences, and similarities around the challenges that people experience. And not just the challenges, the joys too. I found that I'm a bit of a rebel in most areas of my life, including as a therapist. Most of my mentors and teachers would probably have a heart attack hearing some of the things I might disclose to you on this podcast. After all, therapists are supposed to be blank slates, right? I've just always questioned authority. I've always been slightly mistrustful of those in power, which actually might be why I'm so drawn towards the idea of power exchange relationships. So I feel like I'm here to venture into the fringes of society and push the boundaries of culture, explore the taboo, and then run that through the depth of relational skills and the self-awareness that I've cultivated in my own life, personally and professionally, and then come back from those fringes and share a bit of a map for how to explore your own edges. And maybe my map won't be perfect for you, but my hope is that if I start the conversation, if I share authentically, if I bring all of my expertise and my lived experience and mix it all together and share it with you through this medium, that you'll feel inspired and you'll feel like you have the permission to create your own map, to do your own exploring. So I want to talk a little bit about shame and sexual shame specifically. So simply put, shame is I am bad. You're focusing on yourself, not the behavior. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. So when we label ourselves as bad, when we feel shame, we believe that we are inherently flawed, we're unworthy of love, there's something broken or wrong about us on a very basic level. And this is not a driver of change. This is not an emotion that we experience that supports or helps us in any way. It freezes us. It puts us into fight or flight mode or freeze or isolation. It keeps us disconnected from other people. And so the antidote for shame is sharing that shame vulnerably with safe people and being seen and validated and loved. Pretty simple sounding, but can be excruciatingly vulnerable if it's not something that we're used to. And so I say that we all have sexual shame because we grow up in a culture, and I'm talking about, Western culture, but I honestly don't know of any cultures that do sexuality in a healthy way. DM me if you do. I am happy to learn. But in most cultures, at least Western cultures, shame is inherently linked with sexuality. Sexuality is seen, is interpreted as inherently bad or wrong under lots and lots of circumstances. Pretty much if the idea of sex or even arousal or desire is happening outside of a hetero monogamous marriage with the intention of having a family, it's pretty much bad. So when we grow up with that messaging all around us in our media, in our stories, in our society, there's really no way to escape some bit of feeling shameful about your sexuality, even if you are heterosexual and monogamous and want to be married or are married. There's still just this inherent fear and anxiety around sex and sexuality in our culture. So as we're growing and as we're developing, as children, we learn about our emotions. We learn about what it means to be human because we're having these experiences, emotional experiences, social experiences, and those experiences are mirrored back to us by caregivers and the people around us. We get upset, we throw a tantrum. Hopefully our caregiver says, "Oh, you're sad. Oh, you're angry." And we learn what our emotions are called, and we're taught how to manage them and how to deal with them. Sex, sexuality, arousal, that is the only human experience that I can think of that is not ever or very rarely mirrored back to us in any kind of positive or constructive way. Best case scenario, it's usually just ignored. Most often it's shamed or, actively, there's some active shaming that happens when other people or caregiver notice your experience of your own sexuality. And so it's safe to say that we all have a lot to work through in this area. And so I bring that up because part of healing our sexual shame is practicing self-compassion, self-kindness, common humanity, realizing that we all feel this way sometimes. And how are we going to experience common humanity if we're not having these conversations, if we're not sharing about ourselves, if we're not sharing about the topic, if it's in the dark and in the shadows constantly, there is no chance for us to heal our sexual shame. So my purpose here and my hope is that we can address sexual shame together by simply being curious. Brené Brown, I have this quote written down. Love Queen Brené. She says that choosing to be curious is choosing to be vulnerable because it requires us to surrender to uncertainty. We have to ask questions, admit to not knowing, risk being told that we shouldn't be asking, and sometimes make discoveries that lead to discomfort. I'm going to read it again because it's just so juicy. Choosing to be curious is choosing to be vulnerable because it requires us to surrender to uncertainty. We have to ask questions, admit to not knowing, risk being told that we shouldn't be asking, and sometimes make discoveries that lead to discomfort. So maybe I am a bit of a sadist because I'm excited to make us all uncomfortable together. But I'm hoping that you'll join me and we will step into curiosity together, expand together, have these conversations together so that we can collectively work towards uncovering and shining some light on this shame that we all have so that we can find more freedom in exploring our sexual identity. And by sexual identity, I don't just mean sexual orientation. There's so much more to our sexual selves besides who we're attracted to. We can explore our romantic attraction. We can explore our sexual expression, what arouses us, what turns us off, what are our sexual values, which ones have been programmed into us by society, and which ones are actually authentic to who we are. This is all in the pursuit of sexual authenticity. So I am challenging myself to show up here with all my expertise and not minimize what I know, while simultaneously holding a beginner's mindset and staying teachable and curious. So I have spent the last 10 years of my career cultivating relationships with incredible therapists and coaches and experts in mental health and sexuality space. And I have really cool folks, really cool personal relationships with deep, insightful, experienced kinksters. And so I'm really excited to bring experts and folks with lived experience on the podcast so that we can have all these fun, exciting, interesting conversations. We can cultivate our curiosity together and just be open to expanding and learning more about what we don't know while celebrating what we do know. So that's it. That's the first episode of the Kinkology podcast. Before you go, I have a few asks. If you could subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening right now so you don't miss any of the juicy conversations we've got coming up, that would be amazing. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review it. It's a really small thing that makes a huge difference in helping others find the show. If you didn't like the episode, then just keep it moving. Share this episode with a friend or a partner that you'd like to get curious with. And my last ask is please help me keep the conversation going. I'm dying to hear what came up for you as you were listening. Please follow me on Instagram at the Kinkology Pod for more thoughts, updates, sneak peeks about what's coming next, upcoming guests, all the things. Thank you for listening to the Kinkology podcast. And remember, you deserve to live boldly, love deeply, and kink authentically. Stay curious, friends.